That's down.
Always Goop's fault.
It's Goop. We got Goop.
Okay, so let's start here. I want to kind of lay down the groundwork before we get into examples and talk about what we're talking about when we are thinking about misinformation, disinformation, fake news. And so, what are you seeing out there?
For me, I think it sits on a continuum. Right? You have the players that are purposely trying to mislead us. Right? They have an agenda. Then you have the individuals, and a good example for that would be maybe people in the vaccine, anti-vax community. Some truly believe it, others it's part of an agenda. Then you have the community that are trying to sell you stuff, and I think at their core, and I have had the interview opportunity, I'm sure you have too, to interview these kinds of people, and it's hard to tell whether they really believe it or not. So you have that community.
I always had a really good example of this was Gwyneth Paltrow's Jade Egg.
Oh, the Jade Egg,
for
sure.
Egg, which,
What's the story?
Gwyneth Paltrow's Jade Egg. Now, Gwyneth believes that women should put a jade egg in their vagina. A jade egg. It's a $66 rock. And by the way, that's not a good idea, just in case you were wondering. But this is a fascinating science communication story because she started marketing these. And what was fascinating is it was immediately mocked. My friend Jen Gunter, who I know that you know, Jen, a gynecologist, does fantastic work. She made fun of it, I think, in the Washington Post, I think. And others, I mocked it, but it sold out, immediately sold out, despite that kind of mocking. So that's a really interesting example on the continuum because does Gwyneth really believe that? I actually think she doesn't. I think she's just selling product. She's got a brand to sell, and that brand is built on pseudoscience, fear-mongering, and wellness woo, right? And it works.
This was supposed to balance your hormones and make you, a better person. Sorry, this was supposed to balance your hormones as a woman and make you a better person, in a better mood. Okay, so we've got people with an agenda. We've got possibly true believers. We've got people who are trying to sell you something, so they have an agenda, but it's money backed. And what else are you seeing out there?
Then you're also seeing, I think, the people that believe it themselves. You see the consumers who are sharing this information themselves, right? And I think you put them in the believer category, and I've had the opportunity to interview a lot of these people, and they think that this information is correct, but they're sharing it. Now they have the ability to share this online. So you have that continue. But the fascinating thing, as an information consumer, the critical thinking skills, I think, are almost always the same, regardless of where that it's coming from, regardless of the source.
And where are you seeing a lot of this information? Disinformation, misinformation.
Let's start with the big thing at social media, right? Whether you're talking about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the good news is I think that those platforms are starting to recognize the role that they're playing, right? And they are starting to take action. So for even Google recently came out with a policy that they're not going to allow ads for experimental treatments anymore, particularly in the stem cell space. That's really good news. Facebook has done similar stuff with vaccine hesitancy, so has Pinterest. So you're seeing these kinds of moves by these players, and that's a really good thing because I think everyone's recognizing, and research this is one of the things we research actually, has shown that this is a source of a lot of the misinformation.
Right.
The bad news is, they're private actors. And can governments and in liberal democracies, can we really control how they do this? So they're making unilateral decisions about what you get to see. So that's a challenge.
And I want to talk with you in a moment about what you think could be done, what more could be done, because of course there are arguments out there that Facebook, Twitter have been very late to the party on this, and they're not doing nearly enough. And what they are doing, they're kind of being forced to do. But before we get there, can we talk about why this is important? Because take this example of the jade egg, for example. It's not really going to hurt you, right?
It could hurt you, but I know what you're saying. I know where you're going with that.
Or if I do a juice cleanse, these have been widely debunked.
Crystals.
Crystals.
A really good example. I've actually tried crystal therapy in New York.
What if they just make you feel better?
So, I mean, that's a really good question, and I get it a lot. Why are you dumping? I'm sure that it's scientifically ludicrous. Why do you care? Well, I think it really does matter. It matters because people are spending money on this, right? Number one. It matters also because they might be doing this stuff instead of something that does work. But I think more fundamentally and core to our conversation is the fact that it is an erosion of critical thinking, right? If you will accept this little bit of magic, it becomes easier to accept other forms of magic, right? It's sort of this invitation to think magically. And I really do think that that's problematic. And finally, there's other problems, but also it's noise. It's a distraction, right? And there's really interesting research to suggest that it does play that role, right? It distracts people from the facts. And that matters.
Just picking up on one thing you said, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this. I wonder if there are any connections, if anybody's done this research, on people who feed into some of this stuff that isn't as harmful, right? The crystals, the jade eggs, and whether or not that makes you more primed to be open to anti-vax sentiment.
So, again, a really good question.
Yeah.
And I think, so there has been some research done on that, and I think it's hard to do that research well, right? So you do definitely get correlations and associations between people that believe X and Y, right? And they cluster. Now, whether it's causative, it's hard to, it's really hard to tease that out. However, there was a clinical trial, really interesting one that was done recently, call it a clinical trial in the US, that they did find that this information is confusing, right? So what they did is they provided accurate information to a group, and then they provided another group with sort of hyped information, and another group with information that was more. And they found that the group that was provided with the noise was more confused.
Right.
So there is evidence out there that this matters.
I wonder if I could just push back a little bit on this argument, because I think there are some people who might listen to this and say, but look, like the scientific community has not always backed us up here either, right? Like, there are a lot of really legitimate criticisms of a medical industry that is too close to pharma, of doctors that don't take women's health seriously. And so what might you say to those critics who feel like this wellness industry is filling a much-needed void?
And I would add to your list, too. I'd say, the scientific community has hyped science inappropriately, and that hyped portrayal of science is often exploited by that same wellness industry. I think that they're right, and I think that we have to learn from that. So there is some evidence that people turn to misinformation and these kinds of therapies because they feel like they've been let down by science and conventional healthcare, or they feel like their problems aren't being taken seriously. So I think we need to learn. We need to learn from that. But of course, the answer is that's not science, right? You want good science everywhere. Science is not a person. Science is not an institution. Science is not an industry. Science is a process. It's a way of seeing the world. And so what you want is the same critique that we're laying on the jade eggs and the crystals to be used to critique big pharma, right? We need good science. And so I think that there's often a conflation of issues when you hear that.
So how do we wade through this, just as regular people? How do we discern fact from fiction? How do we figure out what good science is?
Well, first of all, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult because, building on what I said about the hype, you are seeing science be used to push disinformation now. So all the unproven stem cell therapies that you see in newspapers now, they use the excitement around stem cells to market these therapies. In my hotel, right before I came here, there was an ad for a skin cream that was apple stem cells, right? And these apple stem cells are going to, maybe you've seen it, which is scientifically ludicrous.
It's like $400.
Yeah. But it's got stem cells in it, so it must work. So that's a really good example of, taking misinformation that's flowing from legitimate science and using it to sell bunk. But it becomes more difficult to tease that out. So you're seeing it also now with the microbiome. Have you guys seen that? Talking about gut health and microbiome, a genuinely exciting area of research. But now they're using that to sell nonsense. They've done it with genetics, quantum mechanics. They use that. So I do think it's getting more difficult to tease these, real from the unreal. So what can we do?
Yeah.
I do think we need to teach. This is, it's a truism, critical thinking skills, and that includes getting a sense of what is good science and what's bad science. So that would include things like recognizing when it's a correlation and not a causation. Look at the kind of study that it is. How big is the sample size? Look where it was published. Is this a real study? Go to independent sources of information. Get a sense of what that source is. That can become even more, I don't know if you've noticed it, problematic too, because now we have things called predatory journals. Have you heard about this? So scientists can basically pay to have their studies published, or questionable practitioners can pay to get their stuff published.
Or they can be backed by like big pharma.
No, so these are just bad journals.
Okay.
These are the predatory journals. So when I wake up in the morning, there will be 8 dozen invitations from fake journals to publish them. So you pay like $1,500, $3,000, and you get to publish your study, and it looks real. And
I did not even know about that.
Yeah, this is a real problem. It's a token of legitimacy. Yeah. And so then you go to the website for this, whatever it is, the jade egg, and they've got a jade egg study to back it up. So it's becoming more difficult to figure out what's real and what's not real.
So then how do you figure it out? Are there certain sources that you go to often? You know, I wonder, people talk about the mainstream media. Are they helping? Are they hurting here?
I think the mainstream media is unfortunately doing a little bit of both. There is, and this is something we've studied a lot. So we've done a lot of research on how the mainstream media portrays science. And unfortunately, often, they buy into the hype, and they buy into the misrepresentations. Although I think it's starting to get better, and I'm curious what my panelists, they agree. I do think they're starting to get better.
Like, give me a good example of where, you know, a really trusted news source failed on a science.
So how about I give you a broader? Do you guys know what platelet-rich plasma therapy is? PRP. And if you believe the news, you would think that's effective. Do you agree? PRP. You get PRP in your knees for arthritis and things like that. So we did a study of PRP, and we call this implicit hype, because almost all of the newspaper representations of PRP, platelet-rich plasma, come from the sports pages. They're about an athlete getting PRP, and it's portrayed as if it's effective. And we found in our study that I think it was 80% of all of the articles are in the sports pages, and I believe it was 95% of them suggested this treatment was effective. Only 5% said that it was experimental, and by the way, that's the right answer. So you have this constant push, this constant noise that the public's seeing that PRP works, and so when you see an ad in the newspaper for PRP for your knee, you think it's effective. You could say the same thing about stem cells. They were terrible, the media with stem cells, again, another area that we've published on. And I also think that they're really bad when it comes to the area that I'm very interested in, celebrities. You know, they really do, you know, push. Melissa McCarthy put CBD on her feet for the Oscars. Did you see that? And so her feet wouldn't hurt on the red carpet. That was everywhere. That was everywhere.
That doesn't work.
It doesn't work. You know, CBD hype is. We could have a whole panel on CBD hype, right?
I would love that.
So. There's almost no evidence for any of it, right? So, I mean, I could use a lot of examples.
Okay, so I want to focus on the mainstream media, and then I want to go to social media in a minute. One more question. Do you actually think it's getting better, though? Because my completely anecdotal observations, also backed up by facts, I think, are that newsrooms are shrinking across the country, and like across North America and the world. And so why is it getting better?
So, and I'm really curious what my panelists think about this too. So it's getting, and by the way, what you just described is one of the reasons that PRP story plays out, right? Because if there was an expert in the newsroom that someone could turn to and ask about PRP, quickly you wouldn't have that problem play out, right?
You're seeing a lot of beats getting taken away. Yeah.
So why I think, and by the way, I think in the aggregate, it's the situation is pretty dire. But why I think there's just these glimmers of hope is that this topic is being taken more seriously. You know, you see the World Health Organization saying that the spreading of misinformation is one of the greatest threats to public health this year, right? You see that kind of thing. You see, I'm going to pick on Gwyneth Paltrow again.
I love it.
But Gwyneth, I wrote that book, where's my colleague, in 2014. And a lot of people said, why are you doing this? Why are you picking on Gwyneth? she's just trying to make people happy. Why do you care? And now she's a punchline, right? I think people are more quick to see something for what it is. So I think that is a good trend. But
I mean, to be fair, like at one point Jenny McCarthy was sitting on Oprah Winfrey's couch, right? And now no credible person will entertain a conversation about vaccines.
Yeah.
But okay, let's talk about social. Can we go back to social media, because that strikes me as such a wild west of misinformation. How is someone to wade through their Facebook feed, their Twitter feed, their Instagram feed, and try to decipher in real time? People have busy lives too.
Yeah.
What's real? What's not? It takes time to put critical thinking skills to everything that you're seeing popping up on your feeds.
Yeah, I think social media has really changed the landscape, obviously, right? And the other thing to point out is just being exposed to that noise matters, right? It matters. It's called the mere exposure effect, or the availability bias. Just seeing a headline, a nonsense headline, does have an impact. The more you see something like that, the more believable it becomes. And there's 2 really interesting studies recently that showed that, and we all do this, by the way, we all do this. If you're exposed to misinformation enough, it seems more believable. And the other thing that you do is you create a more credible history for that misinformation. So you didn't hear about it from Jenny McCarthy, you read about it in The Economist, so your memory tells you, right? And we all do this. So it is incredibly problematic. And the other thing is, of course, who rules social media? It's owned by celebrities. And so absolutely it is, I think, the driver right now of a lot of the misinformation.
We talked briefly at the beginning of this conversation about the platforms and their responsibility. These are private companies that at the end of the day are beholden to their shareholders. I will say, as you mentioned, they all seem to be taking some steps. The communications person at Facebook today emailed me and said that they have people fact-checking around the election. I have some follow-up questions, like how many people and how much resources are you putting towards this, because it is just such a deluge, right? And when an article is flagged false, it goes lower into the feed, so it won't pop up. I mean, we have heard conflicting information that the way that the algorithms work on these platforms try to push you to content that is inflammatory, and then that's how they keep you online, that's how they sell you ads, that's how they make money, and false information is inflammatory. So what do you think needs to happen when we're talking about these big tech giants? More than what's happening now?
And to build on what you just said, there was a big study that showed that, I think it's the single biggest study of social media, and they found, no surprise here, but still good to have the data, that lies and misinformation spread faster than the truth. This was a study that was published in Science not that long ago, and we're talking big, I think it was millions of social media interactions they studied. So this really is a problem. So the challenge, I think, with these platforms, and again, I'd love to know what my colleagues think, is that they are private actors, right? And so do we really want them to have control over what we see? So my gut response is that this is so problematic, the spread of misinformation, that they've got to do something, right? I like the fact that they're taking this action with vaccines. I like this fact. But what if they took action on a topic that I disagree with? Then
you've got a free speech.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So it is a real challenge. So then the question is, do we need some kind of independent oversight? Now I think that given their power and given their reach, it's international in scope. I don't even know how that would play out from a legal perspective, but I am of 2 minds. I love that they're recognized. I wish they did more. I love the fact that they're doing something, but then it raises these really interesting free speech questions.
And one argument that we talk a lot about on the podcast, and that I've heard a lot of people put forward, is this concept of breaking them up, right? Of breaking Facebook into multiple smaller companies that are then forced to compete with each other. And then maybe one of them will offer a better alternative. They won't, have advertising, so there won't be that urge to keep you on their platform as long as possible. Maybe you just pay $5 a month to have this social networking platform. One more question I want to ask you, and then let's bring everybody up onto the stage. When we're talking about who is consuming misinformation, are there specific groups that are influenced more than others?
There is some evidence that that's the case. For let's say in the context of health, there is some evidence that there are particular groups. But there was a really interesting.
Is it the millennials? I feel like it's always the millennials.
Let's blame the millennials because I don't think any are here. No,
I am one of them. I feel like it's always my fault. Yeah.
Well, as you probably know, it's a complex story, right? Because in some ways, each community is better, and in some ways, each community is worse. But there was a great comment from the World Health Organization recently that we shouldn't focus on the communities that are problematic. What we should do is focus on everyone. The messaging should be for everyone. And I slip into this mistake. I wrestle with anti-vaxxers a lot, conspiracy theorists, and we shouldn't waste our energy on that community. We should whatever the message is, it should be for everyone. And I think that's a great response.
Sorry, I'll ask you one more question before we bring everyone up. You have a great social media presence. So does Dr. Jen Gunter. And do you engage with people who are spreading misinformation? Like, what are you trying to do online?
Yeah, so...
Yeah, do you say, hey, man, like, that's not true?
So Jen is way more aggressive than I am. I don't know if you follow her feed.
I don't know if she has other jobs. She's unbelievable.
But Jen, Jen will tell people to F off.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're an idiot, F off. Right? Right? Am I right?
Yeah. I work for the CBC, so we can't say that.
I don't do that either. So some people have, I don't know, I think that's one of the things that's special about Jen. Yeah. Somehow she gets away with it.
Yeah, it's very charming.
Yeah. It would not be charming coming from me. But I used to engage, but I don't anymore because so many of them want that engagement in order to spread the misinformation. And you can tell they're not listening. They're using your feed to spread misinformation. And you're not going to change the minds of those hardcore, whatever the topic. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether it's flat Earth, whether it's whatever the topic, you're not going to change their mind. So I don't respond. If someone asks me a question and they're, let's say, vaccination hesitant, absolutely. I try to respond, and then I try to respond with facts and a trustworthy source. The other thing I would say that's relevant for all the topics is I always remind people to look for the body of evidence. Never listen to one study, one voice. Always look to the body of evidence. And often we all forget to do that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So why don't we bring up Ramona Pringle and Matthew Johnson? Shall we do that? Okay. So Ramona has been... We have not been kicked out yet. We're okay? Okay. Ramona Pringle is an associate professor at the RTA School of Media at Ryerson University. She's the director of the Creative Innovation Studio, a creative network comprised of multiple incubators. As a writer, producer, researcher, and journalist, her work is the evolving relationship between humans and technology. She's a technology analyst and columnist for the CBC. Hello.
Hey.
Yeah. And Matthew Johnson is the director of education at MediaSmarts and is an acknowledged expert in digital and media literacy. Thank you both for being here.
My pleasure.
Why don't we just start here? Is there anything that piqued your interest in this conversation that we just
Oh my God. I was like, should I start taking notes? There was so much I wanted to add. There's a couple things that come to mind. The first is, I think we look at social media and technology as this singular, you know how the car, if you think of a newspaper, like the car section was this standalone thing, the lifestyle section. Technology touches everything. Social media now touches everything. And so when we're trying to find solves, they need to be equally holistic. And what I mean by that is I think the pace of our lives is really, really out of hand. And so you talk about, we don't have time to fact check things when you're reading them.
How do I look for the base
There are
of
statistics
evidence?
that show that something like 1 in 6 people, no, the reverse of that. Most people, 5 out of 6 people wish, don't quote me on this.
A lot of people.
It's been a long day.
Yeah.
The majority of people, maybe it was 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10 people will share an article without reading it. And it makes sense, and I think everyone can acknowledge that because your timeline, the pace of a timeline is a technological pace. Humans have a different pace. We have a different rhythm. It takes us a certain amount of time to actually read an article. But if you're trying to keep up in that frenetic pace of a social media timeline, you're going to share something because you think, oh, this aligns with my views, or this headline is interesting. Even if you give it a quick skim, part of the reason that we're spreading this misinformation is that the infrastructure of our lives doesn't give us the time to be able to read deeper into it.
that's an interesting point you bring up. We've been talking a lot about the fault of the social media companies or the media in general, but it sounds like what you're saying is that we all have an individual responsibility too. Matthew, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's very much our message of media literacy education. So our Break the Fake campaign, which we just launched this week, is one of the first big steps we've taken to go beyond educating in the school system and bringing digital literacy and media literacy to everyone in the population. Because it really is, it's not somebody else's problem. One of the things about the fact that our media today are networked is that all of us are distributors and broadcasters as well as consumers. So we do have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to ourselves and to one another to take a moment to double check before we share something. And so a big part of our education program is to show that it doesn't have to take much more than a moment. That the skills that we teach in Break the Fake, most of them aren't going to take you more than 30 seconds or a minute to do. Because the same tools that are used to spread misinformation, the same qualities of the internet, also make it really easy to do fact checking.
It is sort of the flip side of the argument, right? But can you give me an example of let's say I see an article about this jade. I just keep
all right.
What do I do? I see it on my Facebook feed. My aunt has shared it, and what do I do?
Yeah. Well, what we do is we talk about 4 different steps, and you don't have to take all of them, and some of them are going to make more sense in different situations. So one of them is to use fact-checking resources. So there are a lot of really great fact-checking resources out there. Snopes is the most famous one, and we talk about that one, but there are specialized ones as well, including ones on health and science. And so going to one of those and just saying, has this been debunked yet? We talk about finding and verifying the source. So first of all, you want to know where it originally came from. So if it's shared to you by your aunt, well, you probably trust your aunt, but it's probably not your aunt who actually is selling the jade eggs. So you want to go back, you want to find out who it is that is selling these jade eggs. Who is it that's saying that jade eggs are good for you? And at that point, if you can't tell already whether or not they're reliable or not, whether you're not familiar with them, then you do a bit of verification. But verification doesn't have to take very long. Often it just will be doing a Google search or checking Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia, for all its faults, is a really great source of general information. If you check up a source on Wikipedia, then pretty often you'll know, is this a source with a good track record?
Right. I will say I use Wikipedia a lot in my work, never to source anything in an article, but I will go and Wikipedia will often have source material at the bottom, right? You can click on it. Timothy, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I do think, I'm curious if you agree with this. I also think that we have to encourage people to become part of the conversation more. Yeah. That's another form of, and I hope that's something that people take away from this event. There was a great study from MIT talking about social media, and social media really is a polarization machine, right? It's the loudest voices on either side. And so it was a great study because they had this visual of the conversation, right? And part of the problem is because the people that don't feel passionate about this aren't engaged in the conversation. So if you're not an anti-vaxxer or you're not an anti-climate change, I know this is nonsense. I'm not going to become part of the conversation, and you can have an impact. There's a great study that also came up very recently that showed that these discussions matter. You can change people's minds. You show them the facts, and you look at the rhetorical tools that have been used in order to spread the misinformation, and you can have an impact. It matters.
And that's also what leads to the phenomenon that's called data voids. So some of the times when misinformation spreads, it's because only one group is putting out content in that space. So a great example of that is flat earthism, where for a long time, nobody felt the need to put out videos on YouTube proving that the Earth was round, because we kind of figured most people had learned that in school or at some point. And so when the flat Earth people started putting out videos, they dominated that space. And because of the way the YouTube algorithm works, once you saw one of them, or once you saw anything that was about like the shape of the world, it would feed you more and more of those. And we saw that in vaccines as well, that really public health authorities are having a terrible time catching up. because, again, we assumed for so long, it was such a fringe belief, anti-vaccination for so long, and because until networked media arrived, it was one that had not had much presence in the media discourse. There wasn't a need to produce videos saying, yes, vaccines are safe and reliable and necessary.
And so what this means, and I can interject,
Yeah,
that
please.
when someone would go online to one of these social media platforms and search for vaccine, the best information wasn't accurate information, because the doctors, the World Health Organization, they weren't making viral content, they were publishing research studies, they were working with patients. They weren't, a passionate mom who was creating a viral Instagram campaign. And so there was this conflict, because all you would find was bad information. All you would find was misinformation. And there's actually been a really interesting, I think one of the most interesting responses to this, because everyone's trying to scramble to catch up and figure out how we fix this. I hope you didn't touch on this already, is what Pinterest did in response to it. And Pinterest said, look, we can't win this. And the reality, because they've dealt with this not just with vaccines, but with eating disorders. There's been a number of issues where Pinterest has just been, when you search for a topic, you're getting harmful information. Suicide was another one of them. They said, look, we're not dealing with a free speech issue where there's a balance of information and we're censoring people. We're actually just going to talk about a data void. We're going to lean into that. So if you search for vaccine, we're going to just take them down. There's just nothing. And what that means is maybe someone will go to Instagram. Unfortunately, because they're not taking the same response, you'll just get the bad information there. But maybe they'll go to a government website. Maybe they'll actually go to the right resource. And what they did was they sort of intentionally broke their platform. They broke the website, but they did it in a way where, as you mentioned, it keeps coming back to clicks, and clicks turns into dollars.
Like, do we know how Pinterest makes this money? I actually don't know the answer to that.
Well,
I'm not sure it's the same way Facebook does.
Well, Pinterest has advertising as well. But in a case like this, Pinterest, there's also been studies that it is the most feel-good of the platforms, but it's not like they haven't dealt with their issues. But it really was a matter of, instead of just feeding into this machine and making it that there's information for people because they just want that information no matter what it is, and it's going to get them frothing, and it's going to make them, if it's not working, if people want information but the information isn't right, the system is broken. So we're not breaking it when we break our site. It was, I think, a bold step that they took.
And I just want to pick up on one more thing you were both saying. I forget her name right now, but we had a woman in public health on our podcast several months ago. We were talking about the vaccine, with the measles outbreak. And, the one thing she talked about was narrative, that the anti-vax movement had this narrative. They had these videos that they put together with mothers who were sobbing beside a child that had autism. And she's like, and then, I would put out a video and I'd be like, hello, my name is so-and-so and I work in public health. And these videos don't even stack up, right? One is incredibly emotional, and just, the point that she was making was that, the community also needed to figure out how to craft their own narrative about how dangerous it is to not vaccinate your children. So that's interesting to me as well. Does anyone want to talk about politics a little bit? How disinformation, and then maybe we can.
Can I talk in the narrative?
Yes, please.
Because I think the narrative thing is incredibly important, and there's been a lot of research that shows that a narrative will overwhelm the evidence, and that's exactly what happened with Jenny McCarthy. She's on the Larry King show talking about her kid. She's on there with 3 experts, and who probably studied immunization their entire lives. And we remember Jayme McCarthy, yes, because she's a celebrity, but also because she's telling this story, this narrative. And there have been studies that have consistently shown that a powerful narrative actually short circuits our rational thinking. And so we do need to creative communication strategies. We've got to use art, we have to use stories, we have to, and studies have shown if you do that, if you combine those strategies, you can make a difference.
And how you're in academia, how are those conversations going?
They're going well. I think they are going well. I think they're in fact, my career, I don't think I could have had even 10 years ago. If we went back, it's frivolous. You're doing, ridiculously useless work. And now I think institutions recognize it now, right? And there was a great study that was done in the United States where they found that it was, again, vaccine. A lot of the work is happening here. But their vaccination hesitant parents, and what they did is they told them the facts. You still have to tell them the facts. They showed them a picture of what the disease looked like they were trying to fight, and then they told them a story from the perspective of a parent. And using sort of those three communication strategies, they were able to move the needle on the vaccination hesitance. So I think that's a really good example of how you can do that. We just held a workshop on the power of narratives, actually, and to spread disinformation. And so I think they're starting to recognize this.
Ramona, you felt like you wanted to jump in there.
I mean, I think that the narrative is a huge piece of what we do in the School of Media, and it's a huge thing that we look at. And I think there's also been, you know, for all the way that viral content can be harmful, there's a lot of people studying, like, what is the secret potion to how things go viral? And there's the narrative. You know, the sort of there's the narrative piece. There's also the, you know, what are the factors that we always see in viral content? It is shock plus some other kind of emotion, and that is, you know, hand in hand. In other words, we're talking about narrative, but I think that that's so often what this content is as well. And it goes back to the, like, Johnny bit my finger early YouTube videos of, you watch it and you're on this emotional roller coaster and it feels really good, it feels really bad. This is how it gets tied into politics as well. I mean, the stuff that starts spreading is the stuff where, you know, either this much or this much is a little bit of
yeah.
Well, a good segue to politics is fear-mongering, because studies have shown also that spreads the most, right? Yeah. And increasingly, politics is about fear.
Right. We're seeing this all over the world right now. Now, did you want to jump in, maybe final points, and then should we open this up to questions? Is that do you guys feel like that would be a good plan?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I did want to add one thing going back to Pinterest, because I thought that's an interesting case, and I think, you know, we can applaud Pinterest for doing that, but I think also they made it because for them it was a good business decision. And they did that because it was hurting them in the eyes of advertisers. And one thing that's important to remember, because a lot of us, you know, we don't necessarily realize how the platforms that we use make money. And the fact is that almost every single one of them makes money from advertising. Now, that's got its pluses and its minuses, but one of the big pluses is that it gives us as consumers a lot of power, because the advertisers are the source of the money, and the money is only there if our eyeballs are there. So we need to realize that if we don't like how a platform is doing business, if we feel that a platform has a problem with misinformation or with harassment or any of the other issues that we deal with, in some ways we have more power over them as consumers than we may as citizens, because these are multinational corporations, but they do respond to their advertisers, and their advertisers respond to us.
Fair point taken. Let's take Facebook as an example. I would say that company is not lacking in very negative press over the last 2 years, and it has done almost nothing to its users. It feels to me like, I would like to hear all of your perspectives on this. It's a little bit, and maybe things are changing, it's a little bit like the climate debate that we're seeing right now. Like, climate is a very important thing. I think that we need to do stuff about it. I'm not sure I want to do very much about it, right? I don't really want to change my life to do what's necessary. And this is how I feel like people talk about Facebook. It seems very bad, but
we haven't seen the mass exodus.
I've been on it 7 times today. So, you know, do you think you're just sort of preaching to the choir sometimes, or you know, sort of like this isn't really going to happen? Like, people aren't really going to leave the platform. Something else needs to happen.
Well, I don't think you necessarily need to leave the platform to make change in a platform. And I mean, to begin with, I think I would disagree that Facebook hasn't done anything. I think they've taken some steps around misinformation. I think the jury's still out whether those are effective, whether they've taken enough steps, whether they're the right steps. Those are open questions. But when they have changed, when the platforms have changed, it has frequently, if not typically, been in response to consumer pressure. But it's not from people leaving, because you're right. The numbers are so big that, you know, everyone in Toronto could quit Facebook tomorrow, and it would be a rounding error in terms of their number of users. But they do respond when we go through advertisers, and you've seen some of the effects of organizations like Sleeping Giants that leverage consumer power over advertisers. And we've seen not so much in the health space, although I'll give an example of Alex Jones, who has been largely deplatformed, and he was in the health space. And of course, we're talking about all kinds of misinformation, but frankly, Alex Jones is a propagandist who's really using his conspiracy theories to sell supplements. He's in the health misinformation business. He just uses political misinformation to sell it. And that shows how all of these topics really are so tightly tied together.
Okay, I'm going to be so cynical. I'll just ask this question. So, look, I don't disagree with you that Facebook has taken some steps and that Twitter has taken some steps, but do you really think that it's solving anything? Or is this just a game of whack-a-mole, right? You can ban Alex Jones, another Alex Jones pops up. We're seeing in this Canadian election right now a lot of misinformation and disinformation spread online by these third-party groups who are hyper-partisan. So it's not like Russian bots that are influencing our election right now, it's our own citizens. And so that's just more of a thought.
I mean, as everyone was talking, it's funny that you just mentioned that you had a cynical response, because I was going to say, well, I have a sort of cynical take on all of this these days. And I came to this world as like an optimist. I love the way that technology can connect us and give us access to good information. Like all of the good things.
Platforms have done so much for our lives.
Totally. I unfortunately think that the cynicism that like sits on one of my shoulders is that for as much as people criticize Facebook, I think every single organization, most organizations, look at what they've done as being extremely successful and want to get in on the game. Political parties are not excluded. They will use our data in any single way they can. I mean, this was an article that I published this morning, was the fact that our political parties in this country don't have to adhere to the same laws as corporations when it comes to what they're using our data for, how they're using it, how they're collecting it, which means that they can have their privacy policies, but they're essentially meaningless. And so this is where I'm cynical a little bit, is that I was so happy to get the invitation because I think that there's very little that's more important than media literacy right now. But I also sometimes get a pit in my stomach when I think about the onus being on the shoulders of individuals. I think it's the same thing as like, oh, it's your fault for using straws that we're in this situation. Like, we've got big companies making a lot of money, and they should be responsible, and government needs to be working with them, right? Like, so with all of these issues, unfortunately, I think the reality is there's also a lot of people, and people who have good intentions and want to do good, who are looking at the Facebook model and going, oh, so we collect more information on people, then we can do good better. We just need to do this little bad in the short term. And that, unfortunately, I think is part of the reason that we're not seeing more progress, is because people may criticize it, but they also kind of want to get in on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to have more action from government regulators too. I think, I studied in the health space. We need more truth in advertising actions. We need Health Canada to do more. We need the professional regulators to do more. And this is something that we call for constantly. But you don't see it. And part of the reason you don't see it is because the regulators say they don't hear the complaints. So I think that you need to have people involved in complaining. But I absolutely think that the government needs to get more involved. And I'm a positive person too. I like to believe we can win this, but it's not going to be a single battle. This is something that we're going to have to fight, I think, from now on. It's going to be an ongoing battle that's going to require all the tools that we have.
Can I be optimistic for a
Yes.
second? Yeah.
Yes.
The optimism that I'm going to throw in is, I think the kids are all right. Yeah, I think but I think it requires the right educators. I feel like we've probably had this conversation.
Like the Greta Thunbergs of the world, this generation.
Yeah, and the hard thing with education is that teachers are already so overburdened, and then the PD that's required to be educated in this space is just extra time that I think quite often they're doing out of the goodness of their hearts and their weekends and their evenings. And that is true with misinformation, it's true of coding, it's true of all of these what I would call essential skills in the 21st century. But when the kids know, I think about being a young child and we learned about reduce, reuse, recycle, and repair. We learned about when you flush once, when you flush twice, when you leave it because you're saving water, all of these things. And kids go home and they're insistent to their parents, and I think there's a trickle up that way. And there have been so many studies about how kids are just inherently, we also know there's a lot of ways that they really mess up online, but they also are inherently aware of protecting their privacy. And they may not want to be protecting it from Big Brother, they may want to be protecting it from teacher and mom and dad, but they're clever and they have workarounds. And so I think if we can give them the right tool sets, they will then pull us out of the quicksand.
I agree and disagree. So there is also evidence that they believe more bunk, right? So the example I often use is there was a study that was done in the United States that found that 40% of Americans think that cancer can be cured by alternative therapies. Not helped, not to alleviate symptoms, but cured by alternative therapies. 40%. Over 50% of 20 and younger believe that, right? So there are a lot of other examples you could use. And part of it's because they've been exposed to this noise longer. They've been exposed to it their whole life. And I do hope, though, that they're starting to become aware of the issue perhaps more than other generations. It goes back to something else I said, that there's this ongoing awareness of the problem. So maybe I'm a little bit optimistic, too.
I actually don't think we disagree. I think if there's the right tools, like if there is, I think that this media literacy is crucial. But I think they're the ones who are going to change their ways, and if they have the tool set, they don't want to, get sick and die and have an authoritarian government and have the climate burn before they have the chance to have kids. They don't want that. So if they have the tool set and we can be teaching them what they need to know, the 21st century skills that they need, I think that I think mainly what I'm saying is, I don't entirely think it's us who are going to guide them. I think they're going to pull us along a little bit.
Yeah. And this
last word to Matthew, and then let's open this up for questions.
Well, this goes back to your question earlier about who's to blame, and I do want to tell you it's not millennials. But because what we found and what the research generally says when it comes to online misinformation is that the different generations have different problems. So older people have more trouble recognizing what is fake. But younger people have more trouble recognizing what is true online. So if anything, young people are overly skeptical because they know it's a problem. They've been learning for years that you can't believe everything you see online, but they haven't been given the tools to distinguish between what is true. And so they're looking, essentially, they will be looking for reasons to discount something. Yeah. And so they'll say, well, this newspaper, well, they had a story that turned out to be false, so I'm not going to trust it. And well, that newspaper is the Washington Post, right?
With the public editor.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
So
a lot of the work that we do is around teaching how to recognize relative values of trustworthiness. That, no source is 100% trustworthy. Every source makes mistakes. But there are markers. There are ways that you can look at a source and say, this one is more trustworthy than that one. And the last thing I want to say, because it comes back to that idea of, can we really get people to fact check? And I think back to the debate around auto safety in the 1970s. It's a deep cut. But that there was a debate in government and in industry between airbags and seatbelts. And the dominant argument was, well, we have to put airbags in every single car, even though they don't work as well as seatbelts, because we'll never get everybody to put on their seatbelts. And so the airbags did get put in the cars, but the seatbelts did as well. And in countries around the world, there were public campaigns to get people to put on seatbelts, and there was a narrative. It was shown, do this, it's not going to take a long time, and there's a good reason to do it. It will save your life. And today, how many people drive without a seatbelt? We still see it in TV shows. I hate it every time I see it. Watch sometime. Pay attention. How many people on TV shows or movies don't put on their seatbelts? But in real life, we all put on our seatbelts. It can be changed. But again, the reason it happens is because it's quick. So if we think of fact-checking as something that only news reporters or scientists or experts can do, we're not going to do it. But if we say, there are some basic, quick things you can do that will, most of the time, give you enough of an answer and that you have to do them every time, then I think we can change our behavior.
So I'm going to be the hook. I'm stepping in because we need to
We're done.
close. We're done. So
we made it.
Thank you
Not get kicked out.
to our fabulous panel. Thank you all.